Yeah, I think it's one that, as parents, it's a good one to dive into. It's one that will tend to provoke reactions in your kids. You know, you're not going to need to work very hard to get them to have opinions on the way these characters behave.
Welcome to Popcorn Parenting, the podcast about movies, mythology and the Messiah, although on this case, we're also about growing up, girls, crocodiles and shadows. Intrigued, worried, you probably should be. My name is James Cary and I'm joined as ever by our reformed mythologist Nate Morgan Locke. Hello to you, Nate.
Hello, James. It's very exciting because today we are going to be talking about, as everyone knows from the title of the podcast, Peter Pan.
There's pantomimes of Peter Pan. There's obviously the Disney movie that we're talking about as well. There's going to be a remake, a live-action remake of the movie next year. There's also a movie called Finding Neverland. I saw a play about, I think it's either JM Barrie or the person on whom Peter is based, meeting the woman on whom Alice in Wonderland is based.
That's a multiverse, yeah. That's a multiverse idea right there.
This is a story that is bigger than the 1953 Disney movie, those are the cold hard facts, based on Peter Pan by JM Barrie. So that was produced by Walt Disney and directed by Clyde Geronimi, Wilfred Jackson and Hamilton Luske, and it starred Bobby Driscoll, Catherine Beaumont, Hans Conried and Paul Collins. And you've never heard of those people because back in those days they didn't need to be famous, did they? In fact, their voices were famous for doing Disney movies, but they were not household name actors, did they? They would never have got Tom Hanks or James Stewart to have done a Disney movie. Why would you? Now I'm the one digressing. That is very much your job, Nate. I've done a few cold hard facts there about the movie that cost $4 million to make and took $87 million at the box office. These are very old dollars. These are 1953 dollars. But why don't you give us an inner world? Because we're in one world and we're in another world, aren't we?
We are in a world of the nursery in the Darling household in, I think it's supposed to be Bloomsbury. I think it's Bloomsbury, not Kensington. But it's London nonetheless. And we're told at the beginning of the film, this is these events have happened before and they will happen again. And this time they happened in London. And so the story is essentially about Wendy moving out of the nursery. So she's in the nursery with her two brothers, John and Michael. Beginning of the film, her dad, outraged, says, Wendy, it's time for you to grow up and put all these childish, silly things behind you, and you're going to move into your own room. Then Mr. and Mrs. Darling go out for the evening. By the time they get back, and our children have returned from their adventures in Neverland, Wendy has decided that she is going to move herself out of the nursery and move into her big girl room. So essentially, it's a story about Wendy, even though obviously the title of the story is Peter Pan, and he's the character that most people would think of if you mention the film.
That's like Mary Poppins, isn't it? The movie Mary Poppins is not about Mary Poppins. She is the catalyst for her father rediscovering that he actually likes his kids. And
yes,
the playfulness is rediscovered, isn't it?
Yeah. So Saving Mr. Banks is obviously off the back of that. And they share a lot of similarities, these sorts of London upper middle class stories. If you think of Paddington's very similar, Mary Poppins, Peter Pan, lots of the images are quite similar. So, and you fly over London as well, which we talked about in our Christmas episodes, how you have to regularly fly over the city.
So Mary Poppins flies over London as they do in Bedknobs and Broomsticks, which I watched the other day, which doesn't half remind you of Mary Poppins, and I think intentionally so. And actually, the fellow, the dad in Mary Poppins, who was overshadowed to some extent by Mary Poppins, by Julie Andrews and Dick Van Dyke, he's sort of the lead character in this, and he's really good. He's got proper decent chops, really. But again, it's old London town. Disney didn't have to make a lot of movies about old London town or or merry old England in the case of Robin Hood or anything like
Yeah.
that.
And I think that's because London is very romantic and it's very evocative. There's lots of images that you can show which have tons of meaning, whether it's St. Paul's Cathedral or Big Ben, or even just a man with an umbrella, right? The umbrella is a feature of each of these kind of London stories. And they almost always have to say, here's London with its solid walls and hierarchy and its class system and its manners. And then the children are going to go off to some exciting place where crazy things happen. And then they're going to come back to London at some point and see it through different eyes because they've been sort of enlightened by their experience of adventure. And I think that's a big deal.
Yeah, I don't think you get that so much in the Narnia books, which again are similar in that you've got children growing up literally for decades in another in another world and then coming back, and you just don't see them in this world very much. There's very, very, very little. Which in a way I'm not particularly hungry for, but now you mention it, it's kind of interesting that they're growing up in our world, as it were, is not really particularly heavily featured, and they take on a different persona in this other world that they slightly leave behind when they come back.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting. One of the criticisms, and Neil Gaiman had it particularly of Narnia, is with C.S. Lewis's treatment of Susan. And Susan growing up becomes this big kind of conversation topic about, does she grow up too much? Was Lewis misogynistic? Did he not understand grown-up women? What does it mean to grow up as a woman? And I think there's so many stories which focus on that because it's a perennial challenge. As fathers of daughters, we want wisdom in how do you raise this girl to be a young woman, and what particular challenges are there in being a parent to a girl that there aren't maybe in being a parent to a boy. So I think that the primary thing in this story is that it's about Wendy's last night in the nursery. So she's the eldest of her siblings, and she seems to sort of act down towards them to want to be involved. Although as a character, she has incredible maturity and responsibility and sort of maternal instinct. Essentially, the film is about Wendy growing up and the comparison of Wendy to lots of other characters. So if we think of Wendy as the instinctively maternal character, who's responsible and thoughtful and careful, she's then absolutely compared with Peter Pan, who is impulsive, immature, the boy who never grew up, and he wants to take no responsibility. So it's interesting that Michael Jackson has Peter Pan as his favorite Disney character. And you think, whoa, there's something about that. And culturally, we talk about Peter Pan syndrome. We talk about men who refuse to grow up. And so the popularity of Jordan Peterson, for example, is in part because there are a bunch of men who, for whatever reason, never seem to take hold of responsibility. There's various challenges with that, but in some ways, I think the Peter Pan story is what makes sense of Jordan Peterson's popularity in a culture of boys. The guy who turns up and says, "This is how to be a man. This is how to have rules for life." That makes a lot of sense. But Wendy and Peter's connection is a very interesting one.
That's growing up and girls.
So I think the three characters that Wendy is sort of competing with are fairly obvious. I mean, it's Tinkerbell to start with. You've got the mermaids, and you've got Tiger Lily.
Yeah. And
the challenge for Wendy is how much she is aware of being in competition. I mean, she has no idea what Tinkerbell's saying, right? Tinkerbell is horrible, right? She's so quickly provoked to jealousy, and she hates Wendy to start with. And for Wendy, because she can't tell what Tinkerbell's saying because she just tinkles like a bell, she's oblivious to the abuse she's receiving. And that's part of Wendy's problem, is that she's quite naive. She hasn't matured in that area of understanding people. But then when she goes to see the mermaids and Peter Pan, I mean, surely this guy should know it's a bad idea to take Wendy to go and see the mermaids because the mermaids are vying for his attention. And so in the lagoon, they're basically trying to drown her and she has to fight them off. And while I was watching it with my daughter, her face was just like, I cannot believe what these mermaids are like. You know what I mean?
Well, they're historically not seen as positive figures. And I've just been rereading The Voyage of the Dawn Treader to my kids. And you've got these undersea people or mermaids underneath. And I think it's Caspian or somebody that just says, you cannot tell the crew that you've seen them because they'll immediately jump overboard and want to go and join them and be with them.
Yeah.
There's an element of kind of, I don't know, is it the harpies, the sirens?
The siren call and the danger of this mysterious woman. But certainly for Wendy, she doesn't realize Tinkerbell is abusing her. She's properly beaten in the film by these mermaids. And then there's Tiger Lily as well. Tiger Lily is an interesting character because she's the only other human in competition with Wendy. So the others are sort of magical kind of creatures. So Wendy becomes aware of this rivalry between them when Tiger Lily's been saved and Peter's made into a chief. Wendy is put out at the attention that Tiger Lily is getting from Peter. And you feel for Wendy because why would she go after Peter? He's such a poor suitor for her.
Yeah.
You know, you don't want your daughter to get married to a Peter Pan. You don't want her to be desperately in love with this sociopath who, you know, has no idea what's going on. The final sort of comparison, I think, for Wendy and female characters is with her mother, because Wendy's mother is seemingly similar to Wendy. She's very sort of calm. She's considered, composed, in contrast to Wendy's dad, who at the beginning of the film, at least, is played, Mr. Darling is just a clown, right? He's played entirely for laughs. He's full of rage. He's full of bluster and self-importance. He doesn't know where to find cufflinks or his shirt or whatever it is. And he makes these rash decisions about Nana's got to sleep outside and Wendy, right, you've got to move out. And by the end of the film, he comes round and calms down a bit. But you feel like, you know, is Wendy sort of repeating the mistakes of her mother by, you know, falling desperate, head over heels in love with a guy who's not really kind of worth it. So I think that poses a major challenge for us in terms of parenting, particularly parenting our girls.
I mean, the way you're describing the movie, I mean, I remember all these beats from, you know, from the story, from plays, from pantomimes and stuff. It's a really weird story, isn't it? I mean, it feels like it's been very much assembled. There's a you know, it does feel like it's Edwardian. Originally, it was a play in 1904, and then a novel in 1911. And this is kind of prime fairies at the bottom of your garden, late Victorian spiritualism, Edwardian. And it just feels, the way you described it there, like a massive bag of bits. You know, where does it come from, this kind of story, doesn't it? I mean, you've got this odd Peter Pan character who is is he some sort of like woodland spirit creature thing?
Yeah, we sort of, because he's named Peter Pan, so he's kind of linked with, you know, the god Pan, and he's a bit of an elf.
Yeah.
Here's the thing, it's like the idea that the film of Peter Pan is problematic is actually shown by the fact that Disney Plus give you a trigger warning at the beginning. Now, their trigger warning is focused on the depiction of the Indians.
Yeah.
The Red Man, or the Redskins, as they're called in the film. And I think it's fair, because like the way the chief is portrayed is sort of a bit ridiculous, and the way some of the other Indian soldiers are portrayed is kind of there's less care and dignity given to their depiction than some of the others. But it's much more complicated than that. If you look at the actual story, you have these lost boys and John and Michael who love playing as Indians. And they love kind of wearing the sort of headdresses and things and being involved in this kind of exciting kind of ongoing feud. And, there's this very sort of the great dramatic irony when John is explaining to the rest of the Lost Boys after were following the leader, how they need this strategy to sneak up on the Indian camp. And as he's explaining the strategy, all these trees are kind of enclosing around them with the Indians sort of hidden in them. And then they get kidnapped. So you think the depiction there is actually to poke fun at the, obliviousness of the Western character who has no idea really what's going on, who thinks he knows, but doesn't know. And similarly, Tiger Lily, she's not drawn in grotesque sort of stereotypical ways. She's treated quite sensitively and is a sort of, she doesn't have a lot of lines, and in fact she might not even say anything, but which you could argue is a problem in itself. But just the complexity around the story is that lots of these characters aren't very nice, and they're not very nice to each other. And for a lot of our modern sensibilities, I think a lot of the stories we have now have ironed out any character flaws or any cruelty, which I think in some ways leaves those of us who watch them or who read these stories actually less capable to deal with the world as it is. We're not wise as serpents and innocent as doves. We're innocent as doves and oblivious. And I think there's a sort of a lack of understanding about the world as it is that comes through in lots of the contemporary stories that we might share with our kids.
I mean, it's no surprise. It comes out in 1953, and they've just released 2 years earlier the animated Alice in Wonderland, which is a pretty weird story. And that's the year after, Cinderella, which is a pretty traumatic story for Cinderella, the way she is sort of treated. They don't really varnish stuff. Sort of 10 years earlier, they're making Dumbo and Bambi, which are, my daughter watched Dumbo relatively recently. It was just like, wow, this is really mean. It's just really, in a way, I kind of like the fact that they don't hold back.
Yeah.
But just the way the whole thing has been assembled, it doesn't quite feel like it's of a piece, but I guess it must do because of all these different versions of it, and you got the Dustin Hoffman Hook version and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and I think when it comes to Wendy, because she really is the heroine of the story, it's about Wendy. She's the protagonist, and she isn't cruel, right? She's not vindictive. She gets more of a backbone through the story. Yeah, when she's told that squaws don't dance. And she's majorly put out. And she's like, well, I think you'll find we can. And when she's offered, either use the pen or take the plank, when Hook offers her to either join the pirates or to walk the plank, she's very kind of strong and remains faithful. So I think Wendy really is a great character, and her learning that the world isn't quite as simple and as Genesis 1 as she might like to believe is quite a helpful thing. And part of growing up is coming to realize what the world is actually like and finding that. And we'll get onto it towards the end, the particular way that the gospel helps us to do that when we're parenting. But for her as a character, she's going to come to her own decision that now it's time to move out of the nursery at the end of the film.
So far, we've barely even mentioned the crocodile. And, the name of the Spielberg remake, Hook. What does that give us?
Well, they're interesting in a number of ways. One thing I found out about the play when they originally did it in 1904 was that the same actor who played Mr. Darling would always play Captain Hook, which is a very interesting connection to make. And similarly, Nana, the character who played the dog, Nana, would also play the crocodile. Oh. So just thinking about it as a theatrical production rather than as a film, those two are interesting in terms of the relationship there. And we can look massively into that in terms of that kind of man and beast relationship and how it's supposed to kind of work out. And the Bible sort of gives us ideas about man's relationship with the animals. But I think the fact that the crocodile is a crocodile is interesting because it's a reptile. It's something of a dragon. It's serpentine in that sense. And so that, I think, is supposed to make us think back to Genesis 3 and the prophecy of Christ, which is the Lord gives to the serpent to say, I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed. He will strike your head and you will bruise his heel. So that ongoing struggle between Hook and the crocodile is a very interesting one, and should make us think about the battle between, the Messiah and the dragon. Now, clearly, Hook isn't a good guy, so it's only in that kind of conflict that it works out. But the fact that he has a hook for a hand is significant. So the crocodile's got a piece of him, the heel, the hook, the hand, but it's now trying to come for the rest of him. And you think about is it Captain Ahab in Moby Dick and his kind of ongoing struggle with the white whale.
People who like the Wingfeather books will remember that Uncle Podo is missing the bottom half of one of his legs because it was bitten off by the sea dragons.
Oh, well, there you go. He's jumped right into that typological track there.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things you can do with pirates, right? One of the great things about pirates is that they generally have bits missing, right? They've lost an eye or an arm or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And a peg leg and all that sort of stuff. So there's an interesting kind of thing about pirates gradually leaving the earth kind of thing. But with the crocodile, there is that allusion back to Genesis 3:15, the fact that it's a crocodile rather than a different kind of creature. But the fact that it has the alarm clock inside of it, okay? So the crocodile's coming because you can hear the tick-tock of the crocodile, okay? Now, if this is a story all about growing up, right, this ticking clock is ticking and ticking and ticking, and you want it to stop, right? We're all trying to pause the clock at this point in my life so that I don't have to get any older. And as parents, I think we can feel that, where you just go, you can sometimes look at your kids and like, don't grow up anymore. I want it exactly as you are right now.
Absolutely.
Let's press pause.
Frequently said, my eldest turned 13, and just before that, I just said, of course, you're not allowed to be 13. You have to remain 12 for at least another 15 years. We're not done here. Yeah,
and that the fact that the time is slipping away, or parenting is so brief, is really interesting. And this ticking clock, which is ticking down to potentially the day when Hook is going to die. So it's a really significant thing. The theme of time within the story is massively significant.
We've got one other aspect, which is the shadow. What do you mean by the shadow?
So this is massive, right? What is a shadow? Biblically, how do we understand shadows? What's going on? And I think if you talk to someone about shadows, they'll probably think of something theologically, they would probably naturally think of sin and death, right? They'd be thinking this. We talk about the light and walking in the light, and shadows are dark and nasty places and all that sort of stuff. Now, that is a biblical category for understanding shadows, right? Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. So the idea of shadow being connected with sin and death. And I've always thought about it, you know how we have the cabinet and we have the shadow cabinet.
Yeah.
Right? I've always thought I'd want to be the shadow defense minister or shadow defense secretary, because it sounds like something out of like Harry Potter.
It does.
It's like, what are you? I'm the shadow defense. I defend us against the shadows. But also, you're the shadow defense secretary. So it's like, hello, shadow defense. How can I help you? But so there's an element in which shadow is darkness, shadow is sin, shadow is an obstruction of light. And we have to live in a world filled with shadows. So that's the first category. Shadow is sin and death. Second one is shadow in terms of brevity. And change, right? So shifting shadows are a big thing. And our lives are talked about as being like shadows. You know how we're also talking about being like grass and, we go quickly. Shadows have that same kind of temporal kind of sense to them. That protection is also part of it, hidden in the shadow of the wing. And so the idea that you need to come under the shadow to be safe, to find refuge. And then, of course, as we move into the New Testament, the language of shadow is used when it comes to the thing which represents the thing. These are shadows of things yet to come.
A foretaste.
Yeah, a sort of a typological understanding, a picture of something else.
You can see the outline, and we'll be filling in the details later.
Yeah. And the thing with Peter Pan is that the shadow is, right at the beginning of the story, is something that Peter has lost. He's not in the right relationship to his shadow. And he finds it, but then he can't really get it to attach back to himself. So then Wendy gets out the sewing kit and she sews the shadow back onto him. And so that's her first kind of maternal act, which gets Peter excited about, oh, you should come to Neverland, you could be a mother to the lost boys. So she's got this motherly role in helping him attach his shadow. If we say, as Augustine says, no man can have God for his father who doesn't have the church for his mother. Mm-hmm. So if the idea of being a mother is something connected with the church, and the mother helps you attach your shadow, the mother helps you come to understand the reality of your own sin and mortality. The shadow helps you understand your brevity in life and your changing circumstances. You're growing up from one step to another. The shadow is a place of protection. So the church is your refuge. And the church is the place in which you'll understand these images of Jesus and connect them all together. So when we're thinking about our children, boys or girls, we should be thinking, how are we helping them, or how are we putting them in the church to help them with all of these things? How is the church going to help them come to terms with who they are and what it means to grow up? So the role of the church in the life of our children is very important, from cradle to grave, and helping them transition, helping them move out from the nursery to the big girl room, right? Helping them move from home to, if they move off to university or something, going through that transition, helping them deal with their own relationships. And I think that's a major thing for us as parents, that when I'm thinking about my kids, I want them to be part of the church, because the church has been given to help them, well, not only to be given to help them grow, but it is the context within which they'll understand themselves best. Not just their own actual mom, who's very good, by the way, but they're part of something that's been given by God.
And also when they get married, when they leave your household, it is absolutely fundamental in Genesis that one of the first things that happens is, for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother, it's like a whole new unit starts. I mean, that was very, very alien to that way of thinking. In the ancient Near East, it was like you live under the shadow of the patriarch. But it's like, no, that's not how it works. I mean, I kind of enjoy the maternal instincts of Wendy, and I think we have a hard time parsing those now. And you can also see that in Swallows and Amazons. So, funnily enough, also Susan, to some extent Susan in Narnia as well, but Susan Walker in Swallows and Amazons, she takes great pride and delight in basically doing all the catering, and she's essentially mother. To everybody, to John, Susan, Titty, and Roger, and they're endlessly eating pemmican and all that kind of stuff. I've read these books to my kids, the first 2 or 3, and they're really long. And there's an awful lot of description of food and boats, and it was just obvious from the movie that, I mean, they took the most ludicrous version possible of the story, but I can kind of understand that. But my kids just didn't like the fact that Susan was just rather bitter and antagonistic,
right?
Rather than someone who actually took delight in providing and cooking and looking after, and and a bit of mothery, chiding, all that kind of stuff. It just felt like we've got a real identity crisis problem there. That there's an element of our daughters growing up, but there's also an element of our daughters growing up to be mothers. But that's a whole toxic third rail that we can grab with both hands on another podcast, I'm sure.
Yeah, and I think we don't want to say just because there are symbols of maternity in the church that therefore any woman who doesn't have children or doesn't get married and become a mother has sort of failed to do a job, because they're symbols of not of you as an individual, but of the church as an institution and God's kingdom on earth has this kind of aspect to it. But I think it's something, when we're thinking about parenting girls, thinking of our daughters, that we want to encourage them in growing up as girls, not just as human beings, individual human beings. And that's something that's very significant. And that I think this story raises some really interesting questions about. And I think as a story to share, it's got loads of sort of fun bits in it, pirate ships and, mermaids and battles and flying through the air and pixies and stuff. So it's very vibrant as a story, which is why it's held on so long. And it ought to, if we watch it with our daughters, help them to be aware of the sorts of challenges that they're going to face. And then we can be with them, in the context of the church, to help them think through that more clearly.
I think it would be a good chat to have, wouldn't it? So there's lots to talk about. And also, just to keep it simple, we've gone around the houses and talked about all kinds of different symbols and thoughts, but actually fundamentally just ask them what they thought of it and have a conversation about it, and then have another conversation about it another time. There's a very good chance that if you watch it on Disney Plus now, you'll probably watch a pantomime of it at some point in the next 5 to 10 years. That's quite likely. Or there'll be a CBBC version of it, or there'll be it's very hard to avoid this story, actually, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's one that, as parents, it's a good one to dive into. It's one that will tend to provoke reactions in your kids. You're not going to need to work very hard to get them to have opinions on the way these characters behave.
Well, and that's no bad thing, is it? Because if they watch Toy Story 2, the perfect movie, but any other, particularly Pixar movie, generally, with the exception of Soul, which is a disaster, they will find a seamless, wonderful, silky smooth story that kind of slips down so easily, and it's. Whereas actually something that's really knobbly and strange and, it's a 1950s version of an Edwardian play.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And it's like, and it's still being done as a pantomime now. It's a traditional story, and it's very strange.
Yeah.
And that's no bad thing, is it?
Yeah, and lots of very, very good stories are weird and strange. And as you say, knobbly.
Yeah. I think we're done here. Nate, thanks very much.
Thank you, James.
Thanks very much for listening. And we will be back next time with another fantastic popcorn parenting movie. Till then, cheerio.
Bye. So I think the crocodile is interesting because, the alarm's going on. The local fire station sends out a siren to alert all the volunteer firemen to attend, which may be being picked up on my microphone right now.
You sure that's not an air raid?
Well, that's the thing. Whenever we have anyone to stay, we have to say to them, by the way, if you hear a siren at 2 a.m.,